But in any case, all right.
The link has been shared with all the folks that registered.
Yeah.
Great.
So, so it's recording on YouTube. It's also recording here locally for me. So we're going to have extra backup for all of the recordings. Um, and this is going to be an awesome panel discussion if we can all stop watching, like looking at Matthew's amazing studio there, where we're all like, oh, I'm jealous of that. Um, all right, great. So yeah, we've got a few people watching in the live stream. It's been shared in the Discord for Tommy. It's been shared in Telegram, in Twitter, and a few Telegram places. And everybody who has signed up should have the link in their calendar. So awesome. So thanks everybody for showing up here. And as you guys know, Tommy is creating an alternative World Wide Web. And as you also know, there's some really interesting circumstances going on in the world right now. So the Tommy people haven't been able to show up themselves, the VP of the R&D and stuff like that, but they will be able to watch the recording. And so I'm very excited to be able to provide some of the great information that you guys are going to be sharing. How we're going to do this is I'm going to introduce you as how I know you guys, like each of you, and why I invited you to this particular talk. And then we will, each of you will give like 10 minutes, up to 10 minutes about yourselves or about whatever you want that's related to the topic. And then I suspect we'll all have questions for each other. And then if there are questions in the chat, Katrina's going to be looking for questions in the chat. And towards the end, we will, if we run out of questions for each other, which is really unlikely, um, we may take some interesting questions from the people who are in the chat. So if you're listening through YouTube, use the chat in YouTube, and Katrina will be monitoring that. If there's anything that's relevant to immediately what we're talking about that moment, then you can ask that. So Moritz disappeared from his video, but that's okay. So I'll start by introducing Moritz, who is helping me with the specifications for the Tomi DAO. And Moritz is somebody who says little but knows a lot, which may often go together. And he's working on something called Muse Feed with an M, like a cat says mew. And so he also is dealing with issues of content moderation, issues of how do you deal with different people's opinion of what should and shouldn't be content that's censored. So he definitely is relevant to this. He's also been a long time interested in the DAO, and he's been doing a lot of research for us already. So he may have a lot to say on this topic as well. He's also been acting as the scribe, so his job is also to argue with me afterwards if we have different opinions about the DAO. His job is to have a different opinion from me, actually. So that's great. Yeah, great. And Matthew is I've known for quite a while, also from the Holochain ecosystem. He's one of the founders of Holochain. And the reason that Moritz suggested that Matthew be involved was he got involved in Holochain by starting a group or being part of the founders of a group about creating alternative internet, because even back whenever that was, people were concerned about the internet wasn't serving them well, or was censoring certain things, or was being dominated by large companies, or all of the above. And Jesse I met recently in Prague, and he's been working on an alternative name server, sort of a conglomerated name server kind of thing. I think that's a good way of describing it. And he's done user research, which I've never heard of anybody in Web3 going around and really doing user research and taking a deep dive. And he asked me questions for about an hour about what different name servers I used and why I liked them and didn't like them. And I thought, well, that's really unusual, like an actual product manager figuring out what people really want. And so each of you has really great backgrounds. Moritz and Matthew, I've known for a long time. And despite the fact that they've both seen me not at my best, they still seem to like me and want to work with me. So yeah, so that's my introduction to why I've invited each of you here to talk about your experiences with alternative name servers, alternative content moderation, alternative internet. And so maybe we'll start with, I guess let's start with Jesse. Why don't you give about 10 minutes about like what you found, what some of your research is, some of the lessons. Yeah, good.
Amazing. Well, first off, thanks for having me here. My name is Jesse Phillips. I'm CEO and co-founder of Trustware. You can kind of think of us like an infrastructure player in the Web3 space. We focus on usability, security, and accessibility, mainly for the end user, although we've got a very strong focus kind of eventually on the B2B2C side. I come from a background of kind of, I guess, broader security, meaning that I spent most of my time early stage in crypto, actually in the Bitcoin mining space. So that not only brought me all over the world, but it also kind of taught me a lot about kind of the physical infrastructure, securing a lot of securing a lot of what we're doing on the internet right now in terms of the decentralized side of things. And that also kind of took me down the route of working for some of the largest exchanges. While I was there, particularly at Binance, managed a client pool of about 5% of the hash rate globally at that time, and just saw basically the Zendesk fill up with so many requests. And mainly this was around kind of ownership. And you really had kind of two choices, and these are the same two choices right now, which is, I think a lot of us here probably are very much on the sovereign side of things, the self-custody side of things. So that's one thing. Or you could kind of manage it through a third party, which was, in that case, Binance. And so started looking and realizing that both were hurting people. Like I had a client who lost almost everything because of an API connection into his Binance account. And then simultaneously I had people asking like, oh, I misplaced the treasury management, et cetera. Like, what do I do? And so, I had a couple of other roles during this time, or during the next couple of years, but mainly that problem stuck in my head. And we started Trustware as a way to essentially solve that. That's really what I've been working on. And along the way of just solving security, which we consider the single private key problem, what we realized is that there was a more glaring problem. And I think that's why we're all here, which was usability. It's not only just how do I secure my assets, but how do I get into crypto? How do I become a more sovereign individual? How do I play around with these things in a safe way? And so like when we started doing research on this, what we realized fundamentally, and this kind of kicked off the reason, that we were speaking, Grace, is that people were buying basically security and not using it. So then we started looking at what they were using, and it was mainly hot wallets. And then we started looking at what is the usability of a hot wallet and realized there's this giant gap that is being solved by some people. But, I think we still have a long way to go in terms of identity on the internet, especially when it relates to kind of the decentralized internet or Web3, as we call it. And so what we started looking at is user behaviors on the most notable ones right now, which would be ENS and Unstoppable. With the idea that we could create a product that would be the first pillar of the three pillars that we see in the traditional web: usability, security, and accessibility. So very similarly, and I think this is kind of the idea with a lot of these name services, is that you went from IP addresses to .coms, and that provided like a 10x bump in user or in internet hosts at the time. Then, security, you basically went from a world where you could get your card picked off in the middle of a transaction to SSL, which enabled things like PayPal. And then finally, accessibility, right? Like it's a Google 2009 single sign-on. So we were looking at a way essentially to bring that to Web3. And that's where we started down our own name service space and looking at kind of the ones that were here. So what is that arriving to today? We're very close to testnet with something we call OX names. Kind of, hearkening back to our earliest days in crypto, especially a lot of us came in through the Ethereum community. OX is the beginning of it's like the nomenclature in the beginning of the wallet address. We want to kind of take that and say, well, this is your universal. This is the last address you'll ever need. So it's at the end. So it's your .ox name. And the idea is it's built on Axelar, which at this stage allows us to be accessible across 49 different blockchains. We're not there yet in terms of all the integration, But the idea is that you can have kind of a single name for all of Web3 that follows very similarly to that Web2 that Web2 paradigm of switching from kind of IP address to DNS, and that it's not kind of tied into one individual ecosystem. It's very agnostic. And so that's kind of that bit. We layer our security paradigm over it, and finally we can kind of plug in things on either side, be that financial applications across Web2 and Web3. And really the idea is kind of at the end of the day, we see ownership as the biggest problem right now. And I think we'll probably have a really interesting discussion about name services, kind of identity and ownership as it relates to end users. We see ownership as a gigantic issue right now, both on the asset side, but more importantly, identity and data, I think, than anything else. And this is kind of, I think, a way to combat that by allowing.
Interesting thing. But at some level, really what we're talking about when we're talking about a control over a name in some particular social space is that community has, through one mechanism or another, agreed that this party is who we're trying to refer to here. Now, it could be that it was who got there first, right? Them's the rules of the game, or who paid the person who got there first, right? Who purchased that domain. But there's other ways that we could do that. But we don't necessarily have to have uniform alignment on a name, a human readable name, right? We can do things with public and private key pairs, or mechanisms for replacing those or revoking those, right? There's a bunch of ways in which we can structure this stuff. And to that end, Holochain, the Holochain organization, the nonprofit foundation that runs Holochain, has been working on some additional identity tools that have to do with things like key revocation and replacement, trying to make those things easier for folks to be able to do. Because our assumption, similar to Jesse's, is you're not going to have real adoption of all this really interesting crypto tech unless it's actually super usable and easy. The one last piece that I will share related to that is I do think that there are some sort of unavoidable trade-offs, right? Like, hey, if it's really easy and I've got one, let's say not even like my public-facing name, but my way of logging in. If I have one way of logging in to every single thing that I'm interacting with in my life, that's really convenient. But it's also a point where if there's a failure there, it's really inconvenient, right? The failure becomes catastrophic. And there's a number of these sorts of trade-offs that are always at play. How easy is it? How cheap is it? How hard is it to attack? How big a prize, a honeypot, is there if somebody manages to attack that? Is it just Matthew's data, or is it everybody's data because they attacked LastPass instead of just attacking Matthew, right? And so they managed to get, the passwords, the login info for lots of people's access to lots of systems. And what that means for me is, there aren't these there's not like a utopian, Gordian knot sword. Not that there aren't useful things we can build and create. There absolutely are. But it's helpful to go, there's trade-offs. There's always trade-offs. And part of the reason that I am excited or grateful that Holochain is not trying to create one big social space, but to enable people to engage in structures of relationship that work for them, and to be able to compose those and bridge between those, right? Have the people be the connection points between social spaces. The Holochain works a little differently than a lot of the rest of the world. Because it's agent-centric, you don't end up needing to open APIs between one network and another network. Basically, every participant is a sovereign participant, and anything they can read out of one space, they can write into another. So if people have signed nice things about them, et cetera, great. They can share those nice things elsewhere. And to the extent that those parties have relationship back to the front, back to the first space, then you have some closing of a loop, which is actually how reputation I think generally actually works, right? Like it's not that somebody said Matthew is great. It was that somebody that you find credible said Matthew is great. It's that Harvard said Matthew is great, or Berkeley said Matthew is great, or the guy down the street who really knows his stuff about piano, said Matthew is great. And so the long story short there is, because the risks of different social contexts vary, and because the value that we're like the how much effort or money we're willing to invest to make sure we're playing safely is going to depend on the context. I don't believe there's actually a one size fits all. And so it's really important that we be able to try lots of different things. And in this space, like, if somebody steals my heart that I sent to Grace, that's okay. I'm not so worried about it. This space, like, that's my house, or my entire life savings. I'm willing to put a little more effort in. And so I'll just leave it there. But that's some that wasn't so much background, like where do I come from stuff. That was more just diving straight into the conversation. But hopefully it's a decent starting point.
Yeah, and I'm also going to say, Jesse, you're the only person who hasn't spent a lot of time in the holochain ecosystem, and also Katerina. So if like something that Matthew or Moritz or I say that we think sounds really obvious about how the holochain works and makes no sense to you, like, Jesse, just stop us and be like, that is not an explanation anybody would understand, because
No,
we've been, yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's like I talk to my grandma and my parents a lot. And I'm like, do you understand this blockchain thing that I'm saying? How can I dumb it down? Because otherwise most people won't understand what I'm talking about. So 100%. But I'm already excited to learn more. Like, from what you've
Yeah.
just said, it sounds very interesting. So
Cool. Yeah, I actually had a situation where I had to give a 1 hour talk on holochain, somewhere at a university somewhere. And my mom's boyfriend found it on Facebook and watched the whole thing through and understood it. And I was like, oh, good. Like, that was pretty big. Um, but for the,
yeah, that's high praise. Yeah.
yeah.
Her mom's boyfriend is
It wasn't.
21. So, in all fairness, no,
Yeah,
kidding.
Oh my God.
But yeah, I mean, to people who maybe didn't understand all of what Matthew was saying about, like, you mentioned about how you could share things from one to another, and we actually have that now. If you're looking at this on YouTube right now and you think it's really cool, you can share to Twitter. That's the kind of thing that Matthew was talking about, like sending something from somewhere to somewhere else. And by the way, if you're listening on YouTube and it is really cool, please do share it. We've got quite a few people listening in, so it's great. Yeah. So Moritz, how about you? Go ahead.
Sounds good. It's always funny hearing myself introduce myself and the story changing each time or being exactly the same. But I think one cutoff point that I like to mention each time is that how I kind of entered this whole world and really becoming, I'd say, an awakened, or not awakened, but like an aware person in some respect, is realizing how the financial crisis of 2008 meant that the people in charge, whether they be in politics, economics, or other kinds of institutions, do not know what they're doing, are actively malicious, or just have no control or no meaningful control to prevent big, large problems from happening. And so that really transported to me the importance of studying domains outside of the existing sort of homogeneous or general paradigms that people are used to, whether that's been the universities or in the normal publications, and instead going off-road, if you will, and trying to study things from sources that were not recognized as legitimate or as having authority. And that took me through all kinds of different spaces, ended up with me creating relationships with people from all kinds of different backgrounds, whether that be technology or philosophy or religion or science or all kinds of different of those things. And especially from both ends of each of these spectra, I try to find people who fall on any of these sides of spectra, so that I have the maximum ability to falsify my own beliefs or my own understandings. And I think that's the process by which I've generally proceeded, is to try and find people who represent the extremes of any kind of understanding and then proceed from there. And I think that approach has served me pretty well in gaining a pretty broad understanding, in some aspects deep, not everywhere, of course, but not just in the technical side, but also in the social, the economic, the philosophical, the political, the psychological, and so on. And I think lots of the conversations that we have in these technological spaces tend to focus mostly around a very technical understanding of things, which is very important and which is where the real sort of architectural decisions get made. But unless those architectural decisions and the technical understanding is informed by the actual objectives and the values of what we're trying to achieve, it ends up just reproducing what is already there because we have never actually examined the fundamental assumptions. So that's the kind of approach I take generally, and that's what I'm trying to bring today to this conversation. I'm not a deep technologist in the sense of understanding the TCP/IP stack in all of its detail or anything like that. I think that's actually one of the beauties of the internet in general, that it has enabled so much powerful things to happen in people's lives without understanding the technical complexities that make it all work. I just have to know that I can go to a browser, I can put in a URL, and things happen and I can do things. And I think that's the thing that unites all of us to an extent, is that we recognize that understandability and usability are kind of primary needs for people to be able to do anything with it. And so if that's not front and center, all the rest of the beautiful technical nuances that us geeks and nerds like to play around with kind of don't end up mattering unless they're concealed from the user and they don't even have to worry about it. So that's kind of a bit my general approach and my understanding of the web as it exists. I myself was also pulled into the holochain context back in 2014 when holochain itself didn't really exist, but the metacurrency project that Matthew mentioned was already around. And it really drew me in because it was clear to me the people here were not just interested in, I don't know, making a lot of money or building profitable technology, but instead to provide new capacities to people to self-organize, and not just self-organize as individuals, but self-organize as communities and as groups of any kind of sort. And I think the evolution of the web itself shows a kind of arc. We had at the beginning of the web, Tim Berners-Lee outlining the idea that everybody will have their own server, basically. And that was a very peer-to-peer vision. It was, you have your own server, your server is kind of your home on the internet, and then it talks to all the other individual servers that other people also have of their own. And then as we proceeded, as this web proliferated, it became clear that the average user doesn't really understand how to operate their own server well, nor has the interest or the ability to invest the time and energy to do so, or even the money. Or maybe it's just too difficult to keep up with it. I know that people ran their own email servers. I have done that myself, but it is a hassle to try and keep that up and keep it working, keep it safe from spam and all these kind of technical things that do end up accumulating over time, simply because none of these things are static entities. They don't just start out and then continue as they were designed, but they exist in a complex web of relationships to other things. And unless you keep up with the evolution, the evolving landscape, it ends up overwhelming your capacity to make sense of it and to meaningfully act within it. And so I think this notion of complete and utter individual sovereignty is kind of a joke. Like, nobody can actually be individually sovereign, because sovereignty doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want. That's kind of a Peter Pan vision of freedom, I think. But rather, sovereignty means defensibility, the ability to defend what you care about and to be able to ensure others in defending, to ensure others and to be ensured by others in defending what you care about. And so it's a much more pragmatic, practical understanding, I think, of how to go towards sort of bending the arc of history towards justice or freedom, if you will, rather than this Promethean single person vision that just stands atop a hill and says, I am free. And then two people come and they take them away. So anyway, coordination is really where the power lies, I think. And so if that is a given, then, and what I think what Holochain kind of introduced to my understanding is that it's really in the interplay between individual agency and accountability that the kind of practical freedom, I think, arises. So being responsible for yourself, for your own actions, being responsible for to others for shared interests. And so I think the DNS world that Tomi is working on, and that any alternative internet has to concern itself with, has to think of it not only in this technical sense, but also in a kind of social, institutional sense. And I know that we, in sort of alternative space, don't like to really talk about institutions because it feels like another mechanism of control. But ultimately, that's what we're always building. We're always building either institutions, or we're building small tools that an individual can use, but that ultimately end up not having as much effect as we might want them to. So I'll leave it there for now, and I'll continue scribing away, and we'll drop in the conversation where it makes sense.
Cool. So yeah, this is a really good segue, because it really is about creating an institution, right? We're talking about the Tomi DAO, which is going to be the institution that runs this domain server. And there's a lot of places I could go from here, but what I wanted to talk about, to make it a little bit specific, because I have to write these specifications at some point. So one of the things that's already been pre-decided, because we're in the Web3 space, is that every URL is associated to an NFT. So ownership is very solid, which I find a little bit problematic, because if somebody registered gracerahmani.com or .tomi, then I'm already in a position where I'm like, oh, but that's really my name, right? And this is something we always, and then they use it as a pornography site. And then I'm like, okay, and there's no legal recourse, right? So Tomi intentionally is interested in freedom. And, those kinds of things are a little bit afterwards, right? But what they do have is the ability in the institution of Tomi, in the way that they've created it, is they can block any NFT, they can block any URL, just like any domain server could. And so one of the things so this is kind of about censorship and content moderation. And there's different, like right now, the way that's done is completely centralized. There's a Google Safe Browsing list, it's an API, and people plug into it, or your government decides and they tell all of the internet service providers to block the sites, and that's it, completely centralized. Now, the holochain approach is much more like that. Was really interesting to me is kind of the other extreme. It's like warrants. It's like, I don't trust this one, I don't trust that one, I'm not going to see the ones I don't want to see. Now that is interesting, but you need to be able to create those subgroups to do that. Like my subgroup says, don't look at that. But in the whole World Wide Web, in the Tomi world, you don't have those subgroups. And so if you have people reporting on a website saying this one doesn't follow community guidelines, it's really not enough to just have a lot of people report it. And I won't talk too much about the events of the last week, but we could definitely imagine one faction saying, ban all those guys' websites, those are the bad guys, and the other side going, ban all those websites, those are the bad guys. And pretty soon you have no websites that are allowed about the Middle East, because enough people issued warrants to everybody else's websites, and there's absolutely nothing you can read about. There is no Middle East in the news anymore, because we've all issued warrants for each other. So I'd love for you guys to help me think through, how do we create a system that would allow Tomi to have because they don't want it to be the dark web. They don't want everything to be allowed, but they don't want to be the central authority. So like, how can we think about that problem, which is actually the purvey of like, that's what a DNS can do. Everybody's thinking because I've asked a hard question.
I'll start a little bit. I mean, effectively, what it means is creating some kind of legal system, right? Like, I think there's something that we shy away from as internet technologists because it comes with responsibility. It comes with due process, with keeping up costly processes that make sense of things to a level of empirical standard that we don't generally need to do. That's also the hard problem, I think, that Facebook and Google and all of these big services have run into, that they're effectively governors of these sort of network states that have huge populations, that have huge economic, social implications when people are taken down from it, people getting their Google accounts canceled or getting kicked off of YouTube. And so I think the problem there is less that the capacity exists, but that there's no real enforceability of standards that the institution itself holds itself accountable to, nor a transparency about what is actually offense-worthy, and that you can't get a hold of people, specific individual regular people rather than just AI bots to make a claim and to attempt to get things reviewed and put into operation again when they're clearly agreeing with the rules but were falsely taken down. So I think the issue is thinking through what does it take to create the kind of institution that can continuously perform due process on claims of any kind of nature, that can make visible and transparent the rules by which everything operates, and where there is an accountability on the part of the institution to actually be responsive to the people that depend on it for performing its function. So that's kind of where I would start.
Yeah, I like the idea of transparency, right? Like there's kind of a weirdness about it that there's no list of the sites that have been banned, right? Like you don't have to publish that content, but we can't even see a list of what's been banned. And so that might be an interesting thing in terms of the transparency that Tomi can, because they're NFTs, there will be a list of all the banned sites and anybody can see it, and it'll be very, very public if a site is banned, because anybody could look it up.
So continue. Sorry, I have an idea on that, but I'll wait. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just add one little thing, which is, and especially if the list includes the reason and the mechanism by which it was banned or for which it was banned. I mean, at least then you have something to go off of. Maybe I was deleted from Facebook out of the blue 3 years ago. I was given a vague reason as to having violated community standards, with no specific thing that I did being pointed out and no means of recourse. And I was just gone. Like 10 years of building relationships gone in an instant with no recoverability, no recourse other than legal recourse, which I was not prepared to do at the time. And so I think this is the kind of experience that makes it so clear to me that it has to be about making transparent what happened, why it happened, what means of recourse you have, and to put some kind of onus on the institution to have to perform higher order checks if things go wrong. So,
I mean, I guess first off, just leading off of that, I am very in favor of a world, and I think sovereignty to me, we can debate. Like I enjoyed what you were talking about in terms of the top of the hill and thinking about it a little bit differently. But the thing that sticks out in my mind, not that I politically agree with them, but like the Canadian truckers, when PayPal shut down their accounts, it's like, okay, here's a government calling upon a private entity to, because of a reason that that may or may not be legitimate, to shut down and essentially access, which in turn leads to X result in the real world. And so I think that like mirrors the Facebook side. I think for me, I always go back to the traditional internet and the systems that have been put in place in order to try to answer questions about where we're going, with the caveat that where there is a centralization piece, meaning the censorship side of it, or where someone like Facebook could say, yeah, you're gone. That's where I try to focus the most about the sovereignty and decentralization. And so like maybe one of the ways you do this is actually very similar to how DNS works right now. And so if you look at kind of the flow for a user, they put in a request, right? They want to visit X whatever it is.com. Let's just say it's the traditional website for Tomi, right? The request is sent to find the related IP address for it. If they haven't already like looked at this thing, right? Like it's cached on their local system, then it goes to essentially like a recursive server to see if there's a cache for the name. And then from there, it goes to an authoritative server if it's not. And so like authoritative server could be handled, for example, at the top of the stack by like Google, et cetera. Then the IP address is retrieved, right? And so then you get to visit that website. And so there may be a difference in terms of, if you think about the way that the caching system works, that might be a way of filtering, meaning that everything is allowed on the authoritative server side, meaning that there is all of these things are allowed, but in a similar way to safe search, right, where it limits certain things, you could either set them or there is a recommended Tomi way of setting them for the user. But that puts the onus on essentially the cached version or the version that is most used or most people agree on. I want to put a caveat there in saying that communities build themselves in many ways often into echo chambers. And so you may get a lot of people that agree that this is the way forward. And so then the cached system in this sense still has the failability of essentially this is what most people saw, so this is what most people should see, thus the loop. But I would look towards this as potentially one of the ways that worked, or that could work in the modern context, because it both does not limit, the what some people would say is a desirable outcome, some people would say is an undesirable, yet it still allows for some level of control, so you're not seeing really bad things on a day-to-day basis. The caveat, though, is that you still need a governing body to make those determining rules off the bat. And that's, I think, probably where a DAO comes in. But in terms of the structuring, that's how I would probably think about it.
I'm not totally sure I understood everything that you said from a technical perspective, but
Yeah.
I do think that one of the things that I've been thinking is like two levels, right? One level is a little bit like Moritz's Muse feed, which is that third parties would create safe lists. And you could choose from whatever safe list you wanted. So you can choose your own authority's safe list. And so that's one thing that I would have the DAO, and you'd have a technical committee of some sort that would be elected, that what they govern is the protocol for that, right? They're just governing a protocol, and then any third party, and maybe they give some certifications, but basically, it's like any service that you buy. You can buy your filters or your parental controls, right? You buy those from third parties. But underlying it, Tomi does want some basic control, at least at the beginning, before there are any third parties. And so that's really where it comes into, like, how does a DAO look for that? Because the way I've been thinking about it, and maybe this will spark a little bit more thinking, is there's the moment that somebody reports something really should not be there, right? There are some basic, in basic things that they said, really egregious, child pornography and, horrible violence. But you have to be careful, nothing, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. So you have to be careful about that. And then things like publishing, how to build a nuclear weapon in your kitchen, and, okay, but is it correct information? Like, maybe, like, now that's a really weird question, but like some very, very like extreme things that they definitely do want to be illegal on there. So there's the reporting of that, which anybody could report, you could say. And then there's the judgment of that, which some of it could be done by AI. And then some of it would be done by, to me, a minimum number of people, because you don't want to expose people to that content. And not a regular sitting council, because you don't want somebody to spend all day doing that or do that every day. So like some minimal jury that you can't do jury duty more than an hour every 6 months or something. And then, and then there's an appeal, and something like 9 out of 10 people have to say, yeah, that, like it really has to be 9 out of 10 that needs to be censored. And then something like an appeals council. So like, that's kind of how I've been thinking about it. It's like, but like, what is the reporting mechanism? Do you like find out those people who report everything? Is that good or bad? Like, is there somebody surfing the internet to see bad things that they're going to report? Like, I don't know, like, is that a good attribute, or is that somebody who's like, And then how many people is the right number of people, and how do you choose people for that? You could call it like moderation duty. What's the right number? How does that work? And then, yeah, I think the appeals committee is a little bit easier. That one I had the easiest time with, like that there would be an appeals committee, and that, if you had to appeal more than each time you appeal for the same website, you pay more because, you already got, like, we already said no twice. So, but yeah, the hard part is like, how do I figure out, or how do you like, is it like when you buy domain name, you're obligated to jury duty or something? Like, how should that work? Like,
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sitting here thinking about because I don't spend most of my time thinking about DNS, just to be totally clear. Not that I haven't thought about it. I have previously, but it's not how I'm spending most of my days. And I'm just reflecting on, okay, when we think about DNS today in the web world, it has to do with, control of a website. When we're thinking about DNS in a Web3 world, it has to do with control of a whole lot more, right? Like if we're really from a usability standpoint trying to make wallet addresses or public keys more convenient, if that's the goal, it's a very different thing. like it's not unrelated, but there's a different kind of relationship, or I'd say a much wider variety of forms of relationship that we are going to want to enter into. And again, coming back to the holochain context, like, to be honest, there's some folks within the holochain world, and I think Moritz is aware of some of this stuff, that are looking at things like DNS, or not really DNS, but name registries, right, within social spaces, like across multiple applications, for those applications who want to participate in a registry, and within one, like, cool, we're interested in that stuff too. But that's not necessarily global. Like, even at the broadest scope, it's always an opt-in kind of thing. And the thing that comes to mind for me there has, like, there's a few layers. One has to do with just, how did you get it? How do you get the name in the first place? To Grace's point earlier about, like, somebody else, grabbing Grace Rahmani Tomi or whatever. When I was in law school, I tried to get matthewschutte.com, and I couldn't because somebody else had registered it. And I reached out to the person because it wasn't being used for anything. And he said, I'm holding that for somebody who has that name and who is considering a life in politics. And so, I'm holding it in case he decides he wants to run. And several years later, it became available and I grabbed it, right? But, like, that's the structure, first come, first served, right, is the structure of that system. And as some of you were sharing, the thought occurred to me, like, what are some other ways in which we might structure those things? And some of this has to do with, the fact that the DNS system is making scarce something that is not scarce naturally, right? Like, there are lots of Matthews in the world. I don't know if you've encountered them before, but I am not the only one, right? And yet, when people refer to them in their friend group, like, they're all clear which one they're referring to, thanks to the context and the relationships, right? And nicknames or pet names in the tech world refer to this kind of stuff, right? Where it's like, hey, this is how I want you to refer to me, or this is how I'm going to keep track of you. Like, this is my own handle for you. And it enables me to interact with you in a way I don't have to deal with the phone number or the email or the public key or whatever on the back end. I just have Jesse, and maybe a note about where we met. right? Since that's typically Jesse from the conference in Belgium with the good beer, or something. Likes magic or close up magic, close up cards. Um, and those things end up enabling us individually to be able to deal with things well, but they don't necessarily work in terms of sharing. Like if I share, Grace, Jesse from the conference in Belgium with the close-up magic and the beer, and she's gonna be like, I wasn't there. I don't know what the hell you're talking about, and that doesn't help me find this person. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I think for us, we actually don't even make use of single public keys across multiple applications. It's actually we have individuals showing up with this public key in this context and this other one and this one and this, and there are methods by which you could sign things on both sides going, hey, I'm that guy, and on the other side going, hey, I'm that guy. And now you have at least a claim by both parties that they are the same party. It doesn't mean it's the truth, but it's something that other folks may find credible and be willing to rely upon. And the one other piece that I'll sort of point out here is that I think there's a trap that it's easy for those of us who are trying to design these kinds of systems to fall into. And it has to do with like, if you do this, then everybody else will know and be willing to accept X, right? Like if A, then X, and it will be the case for everyone. And my belief is no, contexts vary, right? So like even in the real world with like driver's licenses or something, hey, if you present this driver's license and it says you're over 21, like most bars, etc., totally fine. Different context where it has to do with receiving a large sum of money, maybe in some underground transaction, your driver's license might be an acceptable form of identification, but there may be a lot more that they need, like vouching from somebody else that they already trust that this is actually the right guy. Like the particular context of the interaction is going to determine what kind of proof needs to be presented, what sort of skin needs to be put in the game for other people to feel safe enough entering into relationship with you in that particular way. And so that rich variety of context, I think, is critical for us to keep in mind when we're trying to design systems, if we want those systems to actually be healthy and not sort of as Philip Sheldrake, who has some really good writing on what he calls generative identity, as he points out, right? Like it's very easy for us to design identity systems that become pollution, right? Where there's like you can have a little bit of poop and it's fertilizer. You have a whole bunch of poop and it's pollution, So it's like over concentration of something. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and thinking about the monetary aspects of it and immutability, right? If you transfer something over, it's transferred and it can't be taken back because we're using no intermediaries. So the whole way an e-commerce site, which is what Tommy's really looking at, places where e-commerce is problematic or the government is restricting access to those sorts of things. Like, okay, now you're talking about making transactions in e-commerce world where you can never get your money back except by the good faith of the party who says, oh, you know what, you weren't satisfied, I'll give it back to you. And you might send it to the wrong, you're like, this is really, the context is very, very different. And also the TDNS, what you were saying is how these things are issued, right? Tomi has issued them by auction. And right now there's a 1-year auction going on for the initial ones until the release of the TDNS for the highest bidder. And then after that, there'll be a 48-hour period where anybody who wants to mint a new domain name, then there's an auction. But how are you going to know? I could, again, I could issue Jesse.com. It's not going to inform everybody named Jesse in the world. And maybe, they hear about it through Twitter and all the Jesse of the world sorry, we're always using your name because it's a cool sounding name, but, are all bidding on this, or all the Matthews of the world are all bidding on it, and we've made a big announcement about it and somebody else did the, whatever. So it's like, it's a very random way of doing it, but the DAO theoretically could say, look, we're going to issue these domain names, whatever the dot, whatever XYZ domain names under completely different conditions. And then it could decide to issue the .io names or the .abc names under completely different conditions, or the ones for whatever, Cameroon or South Africa under different conditions, because the circumstances are different. And then people who want to buy the prestige.com names are paying on an open market, and people who want to buy the, whatever it is, second class citizen names, SCZ, second class citizen names will be, and that'll be prestige in a different group. And the DNS can make those decisions. And again, then it's like, okay, is that done by a council? Like, I feel overwhelmed, right? Like, because the TDNS is going to have the ability to decide which top level domains to release, when to release them, and under what conditions. Like, okay, we're going to do these ones with a capped whatever, thing. Then, but once they're released, it's permanent because they're NFTs. And everything seems to end up being a council, where I'd really like it to be automated, right? Like the jury system I was talking to you about could be automated. We randomly pick somebody, we inform that somebody, they do their thing online. There's no human intervention. Like, you do have to vote yes, no, but there's no real human intervention. It's very automated. But when I start to think about making a proposal for the release of domain names, getting that proposal on the table, and like the way DAOs are today is really problematic. Like, there's some person who's, wants to release the .NET games. They have an idea of how the .NET names should be. They submit it to the DAO. There's a vote yes, no, and it goes. And that's, to me, not ideal. Like, we want to have a proper deliberation around that. And then that just starts to be like messy human stuff, like.
There's a couple. Yeah, go, Jesse.
Well, I think then you also get into the other problem with DAOs. I may not be saying this right, but I believe like the Sushi Swap DAO had a situation where there was like a known bug or something like that, and then there was a vote to change something because it was a DAO, and like the biggest voters by volume of what token did not vote, and so then you just have something preventable. Like, it's one thing to basically say, oh yeah, we're going to have a committee and expect that everyone shows up, or you could just like look at kind of at voting even in a physical sense in the United States. Like, I'm just saying that from where I'm from, and realize like so many people just opt out. You can't do that in this context. So I believe, yeah, it has to be automated in some capacity in order to continue performing the same action, or heavily incentivized. And even then, incentives, $5 might make my life a lot easier. $5 might be nothing to someone else, all the way up the stack, etc. So yeah.
There's a couple of things that came to mind. The more recent one had to do with messy human stuff. I do think that so Holochain has done some demonstration apps recently. One in particular called Fractal Tribute, which is kind of like, there was an old game on Reddit called Our Place, which is like basically an image, and the community was invited to like change pixels, and then you couldn't change, you get 20 seconds or whatever where you're not able to change anything. And so it was a fun thing. Like, people across the internet are trying to like dominate this pixel territory. And so we created something like that recently, where you're playing the game entirely on chain, on Holochain, because Holochain is run as just a peer-to-peer app. There's no gas fees or anything. It's super efficient. It's fast, etc. But we also allowed people to mint NFTs with the Polygon network. And then had a little like, hey, once this is done, like the proceeds are going to be distributed to the folks who had minted those NFTs initially. And so kind of like a fun little proof of concept, right? But for me, part of what that points to is there's a bunch more stuff that starts to become possible in terms of on-chain coordination and the social like sense making, including like right now, lots of those things happen in Discord, or other spaces like that, right? And that's great. But some of our hope is that you can do those kinds of things on chain, and you can iterate on the protocols. Like, hey, we're going to use this type of structure for proposing ideas, and then we're going to use this for like refining those ideas, and then we're going to use this for actually instantiating them in code, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And this is a little bit of a sidebar, but one of the articles that Arthur Brock wrote a number of years ago had to do with broken assumptions of governance. And in that article, some of what he was pointing out is like a lot of the time what we focus on is decision making. Like, how do we make decisions? And we think that's the really important thing. Like, are we voting, and what level, what threshold do we have to meet in order to approve, and yada, yada, yada. And he was like, actually, like, that's not a great way for a community to steer itself. It's not that voting is bad. It's just not the end all be all. And what he was pointing out was what's much more important is feedback loops, right? Like, if we're able to try small things, then we can learn about what works and doesn't work. If it's like, okay, community, we're going to do X, and we all move forward lockstep with one another, then any success might be a big success, but any failure could be a catastrophic failure, right? And if we have lots of little bubbling experiments, these folks decided to go try this, and these folks decided, and we're learning from those things, it actually enables a very different pattern to emerge. It enables the wins to maybe propagate widely and spread, and the losses, the ones that didn't work out so great, to, hey, it only was those folks who wasted their time, effort, et cetera. And so there's some interesting patterns there. I'd be curious about how that could be made use of by like next generations of DAOs, and communities who are trying to do sense making. And then the last thing I'll just say is kind of on a separate point, but to the like, if I have one name or one access point for everybody, there's giving that information to someone is a big risk because you don't get to take it back, right? And one of the things that we make use of quite a bit in Holochain is capabilities. Capabilities is like a way of doing access control, essentially. But the way I think about capabilities is, hey, I have an ability to make my phone ring. I want to give Grace the ability to make my phone ring, but I'm not going to give Grace my phone number or my IP address. I'm going to give Grace this proxy that she can reach out to. And if I have that party or this proxy is on, it could be personal to Grace, but typically with traditional capabilities, it's anybody who reaches this thing. I go, sure, forward that to the phone and it can make the phone ring, right? The beauty of that is that I can give this thing out and later I can turn it off. The person who's received it still has that information. They can still reach the proxy. They just can't actually get to me. And this is an interesting thing because I think it actually enables us to give out our information, to make ourselves vulnerable more easily, because it's not always and forever forward, right? If we happen to give our phone number to somebody who turns out to be a stalker, right? Like, we actually have a way to make it so that they can no longer reach us. If it's structured in this manner. And that's simply because we're not giving out the universal number. We're giving out their personal link for how to reach us, right?
So you call that capabilities?
Yeah, it's a capabilities-based security is the technical term, and there's a whole community older now, mostly. They actually have meetings every Friday morning in Silicon Valley, called Fri-am, like Friday AM. And I can introduce you if you're interested, but you can just look up capabilities-based security online.
That sounds
Um,
really interesting. The
so
other thing I wanted to comment on just before I go to you, Jesse, is how you were talking about. Oh, I lost it. Like, what was the previous thing you were talking about? Oh, you were talking about small experiments. And just today, like, I started writing specifications already, and they said, what's the first thing we need to do? And I said, the first thing that you need to do is separate the TDNS DAO from the main DAO. And just have a smaller budget there of the number of DNS. Like, there's a certain amount of DNSs they've already sold. And they said, why? And I said, you've got $20 million in your DAO. Like, that's why you want to create a little one with, $20,000, try experiments, because everything that we're talking about now that I'm writing specifications for is quite cutting edge and it might not work. And he goes, oh, like, yeah. All right, go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually what I was that's a really good segue. Is what I was gonna comment on is, like, I think in crypto, oftentimes because of the immutable nature, we look at this and we say, well, this is forever. And there's like a very easy fix to that. And this is kind of our policy as we move, is like, we look at testnet, for example, as another form of validation and of testing, and as something that's not just like monopoly money, but also a place to start getting user feedback, and kind of keep as a running system, even when there's a mainnet system. And I think that actually is probably the best way that we've come up with after evaluating this, in order to make iterative improvements and keep like users talking about it. And the sense is, like, this came from also talking to users about what they want on the name service side, because, like, I'm sure I'm not the only one that even now, after almost 7 years in crypto in some capacity, I send $1 worth of Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever it is to the address beforehand. That's my general message pass. See, all right, so it's everyone, right? It's your general message passing that says, is this who I think it is? Is it me? If I'm sending myself money, yeah, then okay, cool, I'll send the bigger amount. So looking at that in another form, you say, okay, we'll just have a testnet thing where we can send monopoly money. It resolves the same way as the mainnet, but it also, like, that, so that solves one problem. Or we'll put chat functionality in, which is something we're working towards. But the other side of it is, yeah, let's not make giant changes, right? Let's test things out with a community here, and then move forward if you get kind of, oh, this is great. And that way you minimize your losses, you increase the capacity of getting to a win. The other thing I wanted to just talk about, which leads directly into the other part, is this idea of kind of the segregated community or something. Like, yes, not everyone wants to give out the phone number and then be recognized by that phone number later, especially if your relationship changes. And most people want a situation where the people that they're closest to are the ones that can recognize them. So I may not actually care about Jesse on the giant internet, but amongst my friends in my contact book on my phone, I'd probably want that, right? So what we've actually been asked to do and experimented a lot with is community names. And the idea is that you've got a subdomain of either, let's say the top level domain is a corporation or a DAO or another network, is that you can have that name exist on that, and then we just do the resolving. And one of the downsides to that is that you have a more centralized system. This mimics the way resolving happens in DNS with a authoritarian server, right? Like, this is the version of truth, but it also allows you to delink the resolving. It's like the dumb way of doing it, right? It's basically, okay, if you're saying trustware, all names resolve to trustware, and then we do the resolve, or all names route to trustware, we do the resolving. So there's no linkage between Matthew and the wallet address. There's problems and challenges with that. What we've looked at is public, private, and secret, depending on your relationships to the others. And I think this is very in line with where we're trying, where even the content moderation is trying to go here. public being anyone can see it, private being maybe it's a community or a set group of individuals that can see it. Secret might be that you had to have an interaction, transaction, or you had to have created the thing with the other party. And so if your profile, so to speak, is set to one of these higher privacy settings, then you would actually not be able to resolve directly to them. And you could change essentially that on a dashboard of some sort. This is something we're working with right now, but the concept is very similar to this. And in the same sense, you could have the same kind of filtering technique be done for a community-led effort to filter content. So if you trust X person, you may go to their filtering settings. You may have a community with them, and that would take the onus off individuals or a broader scale, say Tomi saying, we have to essentially limit X type of content. You could pick and choose. And I think that's kind of where you were going anyway with talking about this, Grace, but like that would be a more community-led way of doing it, while also solving the problem of I don't want my phone number out there for someone that we were friends with, but then, you know, they started stalking me because I have a Bored Ape. Like, you know, so anyway, that's my piece there.
Cool. Well, I'm aware that we have like another little bit less than 15 minutes, and we never got the issues of ownership and privacy, which you were so hot to talk about. So maybe set that up. I know that Jesse, you wanted to say something about that. So maybe set up your question there, and then we'll hear what everybody has to say about it.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much more airtime, but I think the big idea here is, how do you balance ownership in an open environment with the ability to remain private? And that was fundamentally the choice that we had to look at. And one of the ways that we've looked at this is via, I think very similar to Holochain, is via key management, in the sense that it's not just a single private key, that you can have different keys all owned by the user, but stored in different digital locations that allow for access to different things. And that's kind of the balance between, do I own this? And for example, if the issuing entity, be that Tomi, be that Trustware, be that Google, right, were to fall off the face of the planet, how does that ownership get expressed later? So like a good example of this for Tomi is, it's an NFT. On what chain, right? And then you look at that and you're like, what's the consensus mechanism for that chain? How decentralized is that? Like, there's many layers down to what is ownership, what is true ownership, and then the linkage all the way back up, which I think we started talking a little bit about here, which is the privacy side, is, okay, how do I provably say I own this? How do I harken back to it? And how do I also remain private enough to choose who I show my ownership to? While again making sure that if the centralized entity or the I hate saying centralized, because it's you can have a decentralized entity that does this, but the issuing entity falls off the face of the planet. So the immutability side, you know, how do I prove that, you know, in the same way that Moritz was talking about before, like, oh, you know, they just took me off Facebook, right? So how do I prove it's me? So that, I think that's my main question, and something that we're still trying to solve. And again, I think back to Matthew's point, it's all trade-offs, and you just balance essentially what the best trade-offs are that you think, but you don't know until you ask the users. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's some stuff that Holochain's been working on, as I mentioned before, around key revocation, which we call deep key revocation and replacement. And the way that I think of it, and I haven't actually seen the latest work on it, although we think we've pushed quite a bit of stuff through recently. The way I generally think about it is a user being able to declare upfront, hey, I'm showing up like this. Later on, if I lose my phone or I get hacked or something like that, here are steps that I am intending to take. This is the process. So they're them declaring for themselves what the process is going to be, by which they are actually going to do key replacement or revocation. so that and then we might have some smart defaults, right, for folks who are not super tech savvy, et cetera. But the idea being that there isn't just a one size fits all there. And to my point earlier, it's not necessarily the case that others are going to accept that attempt at replacement, right? They might go, yeah, I believe the key should have been revoked, like the trigger got pulled, and great, we're not going to accept things that are signed by that anymore. But should I treat this new key as if it's the same as the old one? Nah. Like, it looks like this thing just got changed 2 minutes ago, and you're asking me to transfer you a large sum of money. Like, I'm gonna wait a bit, and I'm gonna take some other steps or whatever. So yeah, that's just one piece to share. If there are folks who are interested in these things, like, we would love to have people come play, kick the tires, etc. Holochain's website's holochain.org. Our developer website is developer.holochain.org. But we've got most of our conversation happens in Discord at present, so you can find that on our site. But if there's folks who are like, hey, I've got like a much better solution, I'm sure Grace would like to hear about it. I'm sure Jesse would like to hear about it. We would also like to hear about it. Or if you're just curious to find other solutions, reach out to.
Anyone else?
It's funny how many minds arrive at very similar situations in a very similar time frame. So, like, without ever having talked to you, our recovery system is very, very similar in terms of attesting, like, oh, this is the way that I would do it, recover it later. So it's just, yeah, very, very interesting. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting how the way that each of you is looking at this is so user-centric, right? Well, Holochain declares themselves as user-centric, and Jesse, like I said, I met actually doing user research, and so much of the Web3 space is a bunch of devs sitting around speculating how they should do it. I don't know how many of you've read the classic the Inmates Are Running the Asylum by Alan Cooper, who was a product person at Microsoft. And these people don't think the same way as their users do. And we see that now, like there's different types of social recovery and breaking up the keys and all kinds of stuff that's coming out. And I've never heard anybody say, yeah, like what you've said, which is we let the users declare what's good for them. And whether it's biometrics or whether it's whatever, I mean, we've just seen these things implemented without much thought about giving anybody any optionality. And so it's really interesting to think about this from what kinds of optionality can we give people as a design? Like, that's always part of our design. It's like, what optionality could we technically give people? And as you guys pointed out, the more optionality you give, for example, with the content moderation, the more you take off of that central server. Like, it's not really Tommy's problem. We're setting up a protocol where you can decide on your moderation policy. And if you want to live in a filter bubble, go ahead. But it won't be imposed upon you, and you'll know exactly what filter bubble you've chosen, and you can choose a different one when you're at home and when you're in the office, and we all want that. I mean, everybody understands why they might want a different filter bubble at home or in the office, or like, please set my browser to show me absolutely none of this before 10 a.m. We'd all be much better off. Like, how many bad tweets have I sent before my first cup of coffee?
I'm actually curious, Moritz. I know you've been scribing away, but I know you've got things, whether it's on the moderation stuff or other. Is there anything bubbling for you at this point in the convo?
Yeah, I mean, the solution we have on Newsfeed for content, well, we have kind of 3 different pieces that we're currently looking at as the main sort of bearing the brunt of the work of keeping the platform something that people actually enjoy using, and as well offering agency, as well as sort of how would I say, like, keeping it nice. So we have participation protocols, we have content integrity protocols, and information sourcing protocols. And so none of these are implemented yet because, well, we don't have the resources to yet. But the basic idea is just, what if Twitter didn't have to perform platform-wide content moderation, but instead the user picked their policy for engagement that the people that come into contact with their content are asked to abide by. So if I post something, I can say, I want this to be a PC rule set. And so anybody who posts something in reply to that or shares something about it that doesn't agree by those rules, then they've violated the rules that I set out initially as the context in which I'm creating this content. And so you basically declare the intention alongside the actual thing that you're producing, or perhaps, or rather, you're declaring the rules by which you're wanting this to be shown to people. And then you also, as a consequence, have the authority to take down things or moderate things according to your own interests or your own needs. And so that's the participation protocol idea. And it makes sense in a social medium, especially in a distributed social medium, because it reduces the requirement for a platform provider to do the laborious and costly work of keeping everybody safe, if you will. And then also takes away the authority, the central authority piece, and gives the power to the users to make decisions. And then the interesting thing about that to me is if you then make those rule sets shareable and evolvable, then people can start to build knowledge and learning and teach others how to create the experience that they want, whether that be by saying, hey, I have this rule set, this is the way I created it, and maybe you want to think about the same principles when you're creating it, or if I can just say, oh, I like that rule set that he used on his post, I'll just copy that, and that becomes my default now for all the things that I use. Now I have this happening. And if it's easy to evolve as well, so if I have a rule set and then I click evolve and I like add a rule and maybe I reword the first two things and then it's a new one. And so it goes back to what Matthew was saying a little bit earlier about how the evolvability is so very important, because you're never going to get it right on the first time. But if you provide the means to have a smart default, to have a way to update something afterwards, and an ability to develop skill in using something, especially if it's transmitted through social processes, then I think you're very far along on the way to having something that has integrity, that has evolvability, as I say, and gives people that convenience that they can opt into. So how much of a grown-up do they want to be? Do they want to be the kind of grown-up that looks at the gore on the conflict and says, okay, this is something that I can stomach? Or do you want to leave that thing aside? And so you get to choose your level of stomachability, if you will. And so those were the content integrity and the participation protocol, sorry. And then we're planning to do something similar, of similar nature for content integrity. Basically, the question of child porn: how do you prevent people from creating or distributing things that are objectionable and illegal, or at least for people not to be themselves unwitting distributors of things that are not agreeing with whatever rule set. And then the last one, which I think is also interesting, information sourcing. How do you demonstrate the source of information that you create alongside it? So if I make a claim about what Matthew said, I better have a way to show that he has said that, either by providing a link to it or providing a hash or some other means. So that itself becomes another kind of game that makes it more prestigious to more prestigious to play right or play nice, if you will, if there is an easy way to tell whether somebody is holding themselves to a high standard or not. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Brilliant.
Awesome. This is really great. And I see we're at time. I also see that one of the listeners is one of the pioneer holders, who are the NFT holders who vote on Tomi. And he says, this is great, I quit. So apparently we're doing a good job of explaining how the DAO is going to take over from them. So I want to thank you, and then I'm going to turn off the recording and we'll just do like a couple minutes closing. So thanks everybody for just this amazing, first of all, for the amazing work you guys are doing, all of us are doing to try and make a more private and free internet, to make better content systems. It's clear that we all work for different organizations, but we're all on the same team, and we're all out there trying to create, well, really everyone's vision of what a free internet and reliable internet should be, and the customizability for different tastes and cultures. So yeah, it's like fun to be with a bunch of freedom fighters. I mean, we're kind of geeky freedom fighters, but I love it. So thank you for that, and thank you for your time. And all of this will be on YouTube. It'll be on, hopefully on the Tomi. We'll also be publicizing it and putting out a transcript as well, and some notes also for the Tomi team, but any of you guys who want that as well. So thanks everybody, and I'm just